I walked away from everything I had, thinking I could escape the past, but some mistakes don't stay buried. Quick flashes fill the screen, a Christmas tree twinkling, a child laughing, a woman's hand trembling as it pulls away, and Rowan's shocked, regret-filled expression. Florina's voice breaks through, trembling yet piercing. "Do you even understand what you gave up?" Rowan whispers back, barely able to speak. I'll never leave again." The screen cuts to black as Aaliyah's laughter echoes, leaving one chilling question. He lost her once, but can he earn her love back? Welcome back to Beyond Color Stories. I'm so glad to have you here. Tell me, where are you listening from today? And while you're at it, rate my stories out of 10. I really want to know how much you're enjoying them. Also, just curious, who's with me right now? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story. All right, enough talking, let's dive right in. The restaurant glowed in layers of Christmas gold, not the cheap brightness of celebration, but the deliberate warmth of wealth, where light was softened by crystal fixtures and reflected endlessly off polished marble and glass, creating an illusion of comfort that suggested permanence, safety, and success. Rowan Hale sat perfectly composed at the center of it all, shoulders squared, posture relaxed, in the way only men accustomed to control could manage. His tailored black suit fitted to precision, his cufflinks catching the light each time he lifted his hand. Across from him sat his new fiancée, smiling easily, speaking about plans and futures and destinations that sounded clean and promising, her voice blending into the curated hum of the room. Laughter drifted from nearby tables, smooth and contained, accompanied by the low, elegant sweep of violin strings, playing familiar carols meant to stir nostalgia without demanding emotion. Snow tapped gently against the towering glass walls, tiny white flecks dissolving on contact, sealing the restaurant away from the cold world beyond, and giving Rowan the quiet satisfaction of believing that everything outside this space, every past mistake, every abandoned truth, remained exactly where it belonged. He raised his champagne glass slowly, the gesture practiced, symbolic, his smile settling into place with mechanical ease as he convinced himself that this night represented a clean future, a deliberate turning point, proof that discipline and distance could erase consequences, that choosing certainty over vulnerability had finally paid off. As the glasses touched softly and conversation lulled into expectation, the heavy doors at the entrance opened without warning, breaking the rhythm of the room. A sharp draft of winter air swept inside, cool and unwelcome, rippling across tablecloths and brushing against exposed skin, causing a few guests to glance up in brief irritation before returning to their meals. The violinist faltered for half a second, the bow dragging too long across a string before recovering, but Rowan did not notice the sound. His attention had already been seized, not gradually, not with curiosity, but with the sudden violence of recognition. A woman stepped inside, her movements unhurried, unbothered by the brief disruption she caused, her presence grounding rather than demanding, as if she belonged in every room she entered regardless of its price tag. Her dark skin glowed beneath the golden lights, not muted or softened by them, but enhanced, rich and radiant in a way that felt undeniably real amid the restaurant's manufactured elegance. Her coat hung open slightly as she adjusted the small weight resting against her hip, and a soft smile curved her lips, relaxed and confident, carrying none of the hesitation Rowan had once expected her to wear forever. Cradled against her was a toddler girl, bundled in winter fabric, round cheeks flushed from the cold, curls springing freely around her face with each small movement. The child giggled openly, unrestrained by the formal atmosphere, her laughter ringing out with pure innocence as she clutched at Florina's collar and pointed at the lights above, fascinated by their glow. Rowan's breath stalled mid-inhale as the name surfaced in his mind with merciless clarity. Florina. Not as she had been the last time he saw her, silent, still, standing at the edge of his carefully controlled world, but as she was now, whole and composed, carrying herself with an assurance that made it painfully obvious she had not been waiting for him to return. She was not broken, she was not bitter, she was not searching the room with hope or resentment. She walked forward as someone who had already survived what was meant to destroy her. Time slowed to an unbearable crawl as Rowan watched her take a few steps further into the restaurant, the soft sound of her boots against the floor echoing louder in his chest than the music ever could. His fiancée continued speaking beside him, unaware that the man she was addressing had gone completely still, his fingers tightening imperceptibly around the stem of his glass. Rowan's mind raced uselessly, grasping at logic, at coincidence, at denial, but none of it held. Florina's presence was too solid, too undeniable, and then the child shifted slightly in her arms, her laughter fading into quiet curiosity as her gaze wandered across the room. Small fingers curled reflexively into Florina's coat as her eyes lifted, wide and observant, and settled directly on Rowan's face. The moment struck him like impact. Those eyes, dark, focused, unmistakably familiar, locked onto him with a recognition that did not belong to a stranger. Rowan felt something in his chest constrict sharply, breath turning shallow as his heartbeat stumbled out of rhythm. The tilt of her head, the way her brow creased faintly as she studied him, mirrored movements he had seen countless times in his own reflection. Denial collapsed instantly, not slowly, not gently, but completely, leaving nothing behind but raw certainty. This was not imagination. This was not possibility. This was truth, standing 10 feet away from him, breathing, blinking, alive. Rowan's fiancée followed the sudden direction of his gaze, her smile faltering as she sensed the shift in the air, the invisible fracture running through the man beside her, though she could not yet see its source. Florina finally looked up. Her eyes met Rowan's without surprise, without hesitation, without the slightest flicker of emotion that suggested shock or longing. She smiled politely, the kind of smile reserved for strangers encountered briefly in passing, warm but distant, acknowledging without inviting. That single expression did more damage than any accusation could have. It stripped Rowan of importance, reduced him to a moment rather than a memory, and made it devastatingly clear that whatever connection they once shared no longer defined her. The restaurant continued humming around them, unaware of the quiet devastation unfolding in its center, and Rowan understood with chilling certainty that this encounter was not a reunion and not a confrontation, but an exposure. As Florina adjusted her hold on the child and took another step forward, moving deeper into the glow of the room, the space between past and present closed relentlessly. Rowan's glass trembled slightly in his hand before he lowered it to the table, untouched. The future he had believed secure moments earlier cracked invisibly, fissures spreading through its foundation as reality pressed in. He realized then, with a weight that stole what little breath he had left, that the past had not come back seeking closure or explanation. It had arrived complete, self-sufficient, and undeniable. It had arrived with laughter, with curls, with eyes that carried his own reflection back to him. And as the child continued to stare at him with open curiosity, Rowan knew that no amount of wealth, control, or careful planning would stop what had already begun to unravel. The moment Florina's face burned itself into Rowan's memory in the restaurant, the past did not return, gently or in fragments. It surged forward whole, dragging him backward to the exact point where everything had splintered, to the day he chose distance over responsibility and silence over courage. When 2 years earlier he had stood in a stark, sunlit apartment filled with unopened boxes and unfinished plans, listening to Florina speak in a voice that trembled only slightly as she told him she was pregnant, her hands folded protectively over her stomach as if shielding the truth from rejection. Rowan remembered how still he had gone, how his mind immediately began calculating outcomes rather than absorbing meaning, how the word father never fully formed because it threatened a loss of control he had spent his entire life avoiding. Florina had not demanded marriage or security or promises beyond honesty. She had asked for reassurance, for presence, for proof that he would not disappear when things became inconvenient, and Rowan had given her nothing but hesitation disguised as logic, explaining carefully why timing was wrong, why emotions complicated progress, why love was a variable he could not afford to gamble on, convincing himself that stepping back was not cruelty but clarity. He remembered how he framed his departure as necessity rather than abandonment, how he told himself that money would replace presence, and that providing from a distance was cleaner, safer, less damaging than staying and risking failure, how silence felt easier than admitting fear. Florina had listened without interrupting, her expression changing slowly as understanding hardened into something quieter and more final. And when she begged him once, only once, to stay, to choose differently, to see her beyond inconvenience, Rowan had felt irritation rise beneath his restraint, mistaking vulnerability for pressure and interpreting love as a trap rather than an offering. When he left, he did so efficiently, without drama, without looking back, already rehearsing the narrative that would allow him to live with himself, telling himself that if she needed him, she would reach out again, knowing even then that she would not. The weeks that followed became a study in avoidance. Rowan buried himself in work with ruthless precision, extending hours, adding meetings, chasing expansion with an urgency that disguised itself as ambition. Success became anesthesia. Contracts replaced conversations, numbers replaced accountability. Nights were easier when exhaustion drowned thought, when hotel rooms blurred together and the silence felt earned rather than empty. He told himself Florina was strong, that she would manage, that reaching out would only reopen wounds better left closed, and each time guilt surfaced unexpectedly, he countered it with achievement, reinforcing the belief that survival meant success, and success justified everything that had been sacrificed along the way. He never called. He never asked how she lived. He never wondered whether she struggled or smiled or cried in private, because wondering required imagining her reality, and imagining her reality required admitting what he had done. Time moved forward, but responsibility remained suspended, unacknowledged, yet present beneath everything. Rowan watched other men become fathers in abstract ways, offering congratulations without envy, observing from a safe emotional distance that allowed him to remain untouched. He told himself that fatherhood was a role, not an instinct, something that required desire rather than accident, ignoring the quiet moments when unfamiliar restlessness crept in without explanation. Florina never appeared in his inbox, never called, never asked for anything he could refuse again, and her silence became the foundation of his comfort, reinforcing the lie that absence equaled closure. He convinced himself that if there were consequences, they would arrive loudly, dramatically, with demands he could negotiate or dismiss, never considering that the most devastating reckoning would come without warning or accusation. As months turned into a year and then two, Rowan reshaped his life with deliberate distance from vulnerability. He upgraded apartments, refined routines, surrounded himself with people who admired his discipline and respected his boundaries. Relationships remained shallow by design, carefully curated to avoid dependency, until eventually he met someone who fit seamlessly into the structure he had built, someone who wanted what he wanted, who asked for nothing he could not give, who represented safety rather than risk. He told himself this was growth. He told himself this was maturity. He told himself the past no longer mattered because it had been left behind cleanly, without mess or noise. What he never allowed himself to imagine was Florina carrying a child through sleepless nights without support, learning resilience through necessity, building strength without witness, creating a life that did not include him at all. And yet, beneath the polished certainty, something fragile persisted. There were moments, rare, unwelcome, when Rowan caught himself pausing too long at playgrounds while passing by, when a child's laughter lingered in his awareness longer than it should have, when an unnameable pressure settled in his chest before he dismissed it as fatigue. He never imagined a child with his eyes. He never imagined small hands reaching instinctively for comfort. He never imagined being recognized by someone he had never met. The future he constructed relied entirely on the assumption that some choices dissolved with time rather than solidified into truth, that avoidance aged into absolution, that what was never acknowledged could never return with weight. All of that certainty collapsed the moment Florina walked into the restaurant, and now, standing frozen between past and present, Rowan understood with devastating clarity that the lie he had built so carefully over 2 years had not weakened with time. It had only waited, patient and intact, for the exact second when it could no longer be ignored. He had believed running meant freedom. He had believed silence meant safety. He had believed absence erased responsibility. What he was only beginning to realize was that the cost of running did not disappear when unpaid. It accumulated, it grew, and it had finally found him. 3. Rowan remained frozen in his seat for a fraction of a second longer than was safe, the realization from moments earlier still echoing through him like a delayed impact, before instinct finally overrode control and he pushed his chair back abruptly, the sound scraping too loudly against the polished floor. Heads turned. Conversations softened. His fiancée's voice faltered mid-sentence as she looked at him with confusion, her hand still hovering near her glass, unaware that the man she was about to marry was no longer anchored to the present. Rowan barely registered her expression as he stood, his attention locked on Florina, moving deeper into the restaurant with unhurried ease, her steps steady, deliberate, as if she had all the time in the world. The toddler in her arms laughed again, louder this time, a bright, unrestrained sound that cut through the muted elegance of the space and drew curious smiles from nearby tables, the kind of indulgent amusement reserved for children who reminded people of simpler joys. Rowan felt the sound hit him physically, tightening something in his chest as if each note carried weight rather than air. Florina shifted her hold slightly to keep the child comfortable, murmuring something too soft to hear, and continued walking, completely unaware that Rowan's carefully constructed composure had already begun to fracture. The child wriggled with restless curiosity, her curls bouncing freely as she pointed toward a decorative tree shimmering near the far wall, enchanted by its lights. Rowan's fiancée reached for his arm instinctively, trying to ground him, but he stepped away without explanation, his body reacting before his mind could shape words. His pulse hammered violently now, the sound rushing in his ears as the space between him and Florina seemed to stretch and compress at once, each step she took pulling him further from the version of himself he had believed in just minutes earlier. Then the child turned. It was not dramatic or deliberate, just a simple, natural movement prompted by curiosity, but the effect was catastrophic. Her laughter softened into a quiet hum as her head tilted slightly, her gaze drifting across the room until it landed directly on Rowan. The instant their eyes met, something in him collapsed completely. His chest tightened with sharp, breath-stealing force, pain blooming where certainty had once lived, because there was no mistaking it now. Those eyes were his, not similar, not reminiscent, his. The shape, the depth, the way focus sharpened with interest rather than fear. Even the faint crease between her brows as she studied him mirrored an expression he had seen countless times in mirrors and photographs. The way she tilted her head, thoughtful and observant, echoed a gesture he had been unconsciously making his entire life. Denial did not fight for survival. It vanished instantly, stripped of credibility by biology and instinct, leaving behind raw, unfiltered terror. Rowan felt it flood through him, cold and absolute, because this truth did not arrive alone. It carried implications, consequences, responsibility and time, years of time he could never reclaim. His fiancée followed his stare now, sensing the gravity of whatever held him so completely, her confusion deepening into unease as she searched for the source of his sudden disintegration. She noticed Florina. She noticed the child. She noticed the way Rowan stopped breathing. Florina slowed then, as if aware of a shift she could not yet see, and finally looked up. Her gaze met Rowan's directly, calmly, without the slightest flicker of surprise or hesitation. There was no shock in her eyes, no tightening of her jaw, no visible reaction that suggested unresolved emotion. She simply looked at him, acknowledging his existence in the same way one acknowledges a stranger encountered unexpectedly in a familiar place. And then she smiled. It was polite, restrained, and distant, a smile shaped by boundaries rather than warmth, carrying no invitation and no history. That smile did something no accusation ever could. It erased him. It placed him firmly in the past without granting him the dignity of relevance. Rowan felt the impact more sharply than the realization of the child's identity. Discovering the truth had been devastating, but this calm dismissal was annihilating. It told him everything he needed to know about the life Florina had built without him. She was not guarding herself against pain. She was simply no longer organized around him. The restaurant continued to breathe around them, unaware of the quiet reckoning unfolding in its center, and Rowan stood exposed in a way no boardroom confrontation had ever managed to achieve. His fiancée's hand tightened around her glass, knuckles whitening as she sensed the depth of what she was witnessing without fully understanding it, while nearby diners resumed their conversations, the moment passing unnoticed by everyone except the 4 lives now irrevocably entangled by it. The child continued to stare at Rowan openly, unburdened by history or expectation, her expression curious rather than afraid. She did not look away when Florina shifted slightly, adjusting her grip, and Rowan realized with a sickening twist that this small living truth was not uncomfortable with him. She felt no instinctive distance. She had no reason to. That realization pressed down on him harder than guilt ever had. Florina's smile lingered for only a second longer before she turned her attention back to her daughter, murmuring softly again as she resumed walking, her body language relaxed, composed, entirely uninterested in managing Rowan's reaction. As Florina moved past, the distance between them closing and then slipping away, Rowan remained standing, suspended between impulse and restraint, every instinct screaming to follow, to speak, to do something before the moment vanished completely. His fiancée watched him closely now, the weight of his silence finally alarming, while the child's laughter echoed faintly behind Florina's retreating form. Rowan understood with brutal clarity that this was not the end of the moment, but the beginning of something far more dangerous. The truth had surfaced, undeniable and alive, and it had already begun to shift the balance of his life without asking permission. And as Florina disappeared into the golden glow of the restaurant's deeper space, Rowan knew with chilling certainty that the child with his eyes had already changed everything, whether he was ready to face it or not. Florina passed Rowan without slowing, her shoulder moving through the space beside him as cleanly as if he were part of the decor rather than a man whose life had once intersected with hers, and the absence of hesitation in that single motion struck harder than any confrontation could have. She did not stiffen, did not avert her eyes defensively, did not acknowledge the tension vibrating through the air around him. She simply continued forward, her attention already redirected toward the counter near the window where the staff prepared drinks, her posture relaxed, balanced, unburdened. Rowan stood frozen in the narrow space she left behind, the faint trace of her perfume lingering just long enough to register before dissolving, his body instinctively turning as if pulled by gravity rather than will. The restaurant resumed its gentle rhythm around them, plates clinking softly, voices blending into a low hum, unaware that something irrevocable was unfolding in plain sight. Florina shifted the child onto her other hip with practiced ease and ordered hot chocolate in a calm, steady voice, specifying the temperature and thanking the waiter warmly, her tone kind without performance. The toddler bounced slightly in her arms, delighted by the attention, tugging playfully at Florina's hair as she laughed, her joy unfiltered and secure. Rowan watched the interaction unfold with a growing pressure in his chest, because there was no tension here, no strain, no sign of struggle or instability. This was routine. This was comfort. This was a life built carefully, intentionally, without him. He took a half step forward without realizing it, the instinct to close distance overpowering restraint, and when he whispered Florina's name, the sound fractured on the way out, stripped of authority, barely audible even to himself. Florina paused. She did not turn fully toward him. She did not face him as an equal in conversation. Instead, she angled her head just enough to acknowledge the sound, her profile composed, her expression unchanged. When she spoke, her voice carried no sharpness, no bitterness, no raised volume that might have drawn attention. It was controlled, even devastatingly calm. She corrected him gently, reminding him that he had lost the right to speak her name softly, that familiarity had been surrendered the moment he chose absence over responsibility. The words were not delivered as punishment. They were stated as fact. Rowan felt them land with crushing weight because there was no emotion to argue against, no anger to soothe, no wound to apologize into. Behind him, his fiancée stiffened, the realization finally settling into place with uncomfortable clarity. This was not coincidence. This was not an awkward reunion. This was history resurfacing with consequence, and she could see it in the way Rowan's posture collapsed inward, in the way his confidence evaporated under Florina's restraint. Rowan tried to speak again, instinctively reaching for explanation, for context, for anything that might slow the unraveling, but Florina lifted a single hand, not dramatically, not forcefully, just enough to stop him, and the gesture carried absolute authority. The boundary was unmistakable. This conversation was not open for negotiation. The child laughed again, fingers tightening in Florina's hair as she leaned closer, utterly unconcerned by the tension surrounding her, secure in the warmth of the arms holding her. Rowan watched the interaction with a hollow ache spreading through him because what he saw was not survival patched together through struggle, but stability grown through consistency. There was affection here, unforced and abundant. There was trust. There was safety. All of it existed without his contribution. The truth settled deeper with each passing second. Florina had not merely endured his absence. She had transformed beyond the space he left behind. Florina finally turned fully toward him then, not to invite conversation, but to close it. Her eyes met his, steadily, unclouded by resentment or longing, and in that moment Rowan understood that anger would have been easier to endure. Anger implied attachment. Anger suggested unfinished business. What he saw instead was resolution. She looked at him without hatred, without nostalgia, without expectation, and the neutrality in her gaze stripped him of significance more completely than rejection ever could. She did not need him to understand her pain. She did not need him to acknowledge his failure. She had already moved beyond the need for validation. Without another word, Florina turned away, guiding her daughter gently toward a nearby table, her steps unhurried, her presence intact. The waiter returned with the hot chocolate, setting it down with a polite smile, unaware that he was witnessing the quiet aftermath of a life fracture. Rowan remained standing where she left him, exposed and silent, the weight of public ruin settling in slowly as awareness crept back in. Conversations continued around him. Laughter resumed. His fiancée stood frozen at the table behind him, the future she thought she was stepping into suddenly unstable beneath her feet. And as Florina helped her daughter wrap small hands around the warm mug, smiling softly at her delight, Rowan realized with brutal clarity that the smile that had just passed him by had not been meant to wound him at all. It had simply revealed the truth, and the truth was far more destructive than anger could ever be. Rowan stepped out into the cold, the sharp air of winter immediately striking his skin, leaving a sting that was nothing compared to the ache lodged deep in his chest. Snow fell gently, covering the pavement in a soft white layer that reflected the golden glow of the restaurant's lights, each flake sparkling briefly before dissolving into wetness beneath his shoes. The murmurs from inside, the curious glances, the subtle whispers, faded behind him as he followed Florina, his pace uncertain yet compelled by a gravity he could not resist, drawn forward by the small child who moved confidently in her arms as if the world had always been structured around their steps, not his. Rowan's voice caught in his throat before he even managed to form words, the questions he had rehearsed for 2 years, spilling out without order or hesitation, driven by a mixture of fear, guilt, and the raw urgency of realizing what he had lost. He asked questions he had no right to ask: how she had managed, how the nights had passed, how the child had survived in a world he had abandoned, what sacrifices had been made, what strength had been forged in silence. And each one landed on the still, composed face of Florina without eliciting anger, without tearful collapse, without melodramatic accusation, because she had nothing left to prove. Florina spoke calmly, each word measured and deliberate, her voice carrying through the snow with a quiet authority that left no space for negotiation. She explained the nights she had worked, the hours she had endured, the endless vigilance required to raise a child alone, all without once seeking pity or recognition. Rowan listened, absorbing a catalogue of hardship and triumph that was not softened by nostalgia or manipulated with sentiment. Her recounting had a rhythm, a weight, that made every detail settle like bricks against his chest, and he felt the cold press harder, as though the winter itself conspired with her words to remind him of what he had forsaken. Every mention of resilience, of nights spent alone while the world slept, every glance at the small child tucked against her, reminded him that his absence had not broken her. She had been trained to endure, to adapt, to persist without dependency, to exist as though he had never belonged in her life. Rowan had imagined power, imagined wealth, imagined authority as instruments of redemption. None of them mattered here. None of them could undo what she had learned without him. The child looked up at him occasionally, curiosity and innocence reflecting from her wide eyes, entirely unburdened by the weight of history or the concept of abandonment. Rowan found himself reaching instinctively, his hand outstretched toward the small warmth of her presence, and almost recoiled as the realization hit that connection was not granted lightly. Florina stepped back immediately, the motion subtle yet absolute, drawing a boundary that he had no authority to cross. It was a line enforced not with anger, but with clarity, a demarcation of what could not be taken for granted, a quiet assertion that love and care must be earned through commitment rather than claimed through bloodline alone. Rowan's fingers hovered inches from hers and the child's, frozen by the shock of this truth, the sudden clarity of powerlessness overwhelming him in ways money or influence had never taught him. Her voice cut through the silence again, quieter this time, almost intimate but edged with steel. "You didn't break me," she said, low, controlled, and devastatingly precise, each word carrying the weight of years lived without him, each syllable a hammer against the fragile armor of his ego. "You trained me to live without you." The words struck him like ice, sinking deeper than any confrontation ever could. Rowan's chest constricted painfully, his breath shallow as he processed the cruel efficiency of her sentence. It was neither accusation nor plea, it was fact, truth rendered without embellishment or emotional concession. Rowan felt the full impact of it, the absence, the endurance, the independence, manifesting as a mirror to his own failings, each reflection sharper and more unbearable than the last. Snow swirled around them, coating the streets in a soft white, yet the cold was nothing compared to the void inside him, an emptiness created by decades of self-interest, crystallized into a moment of inescapable reckoning. Rowan wanted to speak, to justify, to explain the years, the choices, the fear that had driven him to abandon her, but Florina's steady gaze and precise calm suffocated any impulse. The words lodged in his throat, heavy and futile, while the child's innocent fingers tugged again at her mother's hair, laughing with the lightness of a world untouched by guilt or regret. Rowan's mind raced, tracing paths he had not dared to consider. Remorse, apology, presence, restitution, but he recognized that none of these could erase the life that had grown in parallel to his own absence. The landscape of his mistakes stretched before him like unbroken ice, each crack reflecting a choice he could never undo. Florina adjusted the child against her hip once more and started walking slowly toward the nearest parked car, deliberately controlling pace and momentum, leaving Rowan staggering to keep up, the cold seeping into his clothes but not touching the internal ache that had rooted him in place. Each step forward was a challenge, each glance at the child a reminder of everything he had missed, and he understood, in a way he had never before, that presence alone could not compensate for years of absence. The snow continued to fall, silent and serene, but beneath its gentle cover, the weight of accountability pressed against him relentlessly. He could not ignore it, could not escape it, could not purchase reprieve. And then, as Florina looked briefly over her shoulder without breaking stride, her eyes meeting his with calm authority, Rowan felt the sharpest cut yet. A recognition that she held all the power here, that she could choose to allow him forward or keep him at bay, and that any misstep now would not just fail, but erase the fragile hope he had only just begun to grasp. The world narrowed to that glance. That boundary, that impossible choice between reconciliation and exclusion, and in that heartbeat, Rowan realized that the truth without mercy was the kind that demanded transformation, demanded humility, demanded he surrender control entirely if he ever hoped to step back into their lives. 6. Days passed like a slow, grinding tide, each one stretching longer than the last, until Rowan found himself standing outside Florina's apartment building, the snow from weeks prior still clinging to the edges of the sidewalk, melting into icy puddles beneath his shoes. He stared at the building, its facade ordinary and unremarkable, a stark contrast to the chaos roiling inside him, a chaos that no luxury, no wealth, no influence could suppress. His hands, usually steady and commanding, fumbled briefly with the zipper of his coat, adjusting it with a tension born of vulnerability rather than routine. He had rehearsed this moment countless times in private offices, hotel rooms, and darkened hallways of boardrooms, imagining outcomes, strategizing words, envisioning his place in her life. But rehearsal could not capture the weight of standing here, feet planted firmly on concrete, fully exposed to the reality of what he had destroyed and what he had yet to earn. Rowan did not arrive with lawyers waiting in the wings, nor did he carry documents filled with conditions or demands. There were no gifts to soften the impact, no payments to substitute for presence, no calculated moves to assert ownership over a life he had once abandoned. He arrived with fear, raw and unadulterated, with humility that tasted bitter on his tongue, recognizing in that moment that influence, money, and power were meaningless in the face of a mother who had mastered survival without him. Each breath felt heavy, each exhale a reminder of the years he had lost, and his heart thudded violently in a chest that felt both constricted and hollow. He pressed the buzzer and waited, the sound echoing into the hallway, fragile yet definitive, a herald of intrusion into a world that had moved on without his presence. Florina opened the door slowly, her posture rigid but not defensive, eyes assessing, unreadable. There was no invitation in her stance, no warmth softened by relief, no acknowledgement that his arrival carried significance beyond itself. Rowan spoke before hesitation could paralyze him further, voice low, careful, and threaded with the uncertainty he rarely allowed himself to exhibit. He asked to meet the child properly, to be introduced in a way that acknowledged reality without presumption, to bridge the chasm of absence without overstepping boundaries. He spoke cautiously, aware of the fragile ground beneath his words, each syllable heavy with unspoken guilt. Each pause weighted with the knowledge that any misstep could solidify rejection instead of opening opportunity. Florina said nothing at first. She listened, silent and still, the apartment framing her as a figure of authority and endurance. Her silence carried volume. It was neither receptive nor dismissive but exact, a measure of control that left Rowan exposed, unsure whether his words were adequate, acceptable, or simply irrelevant. She made no promises, offered no comfort, offered no reassurances that the world had not already denied him. Rowan felt every second stretch, each one a test of patience and humility he had long ignored in favor of certainty and success. Finally, with careful deliberation, she allowed the small child, Elia, to step forward into the apartment's light, her gaze never leaving Rowan's face, ensuring that observation, instruction, and vigilance remained intact. Rowan knelt, a position unfamiliar to him outside of staged encounters or office photo ops. He lowered himself to Elia's height, every movement deliberate yet trembling, unsure how to navigate the world of play and innocence that had unfolded in his absence. Elia's eyes studied him intently, her expression curious but unguarded, neither fearful nor wary, simply absorbing the presence of the man whose reflection she carried in her own. The child extended a small hand, and Rowan, guided more by instinct than courage, took it, feeling the fragile weight of trust pressing into his palm. She handed him a toy, a simple gesture loaded with more consequence than any corporate agreement could carry, and Rowan's chest tightened as something inside him broke open, a fracture long avoided, exposing raw emotion that wealth and control had never touched. Florina watched, posture straight, jaw set, her gaze unreadable yet unblinking. She offered no commentary, no applause, no acknowledgement beyond measured observation. Rowan sensed her quiet authority, the unspoken standard by which every interaction would be judged. "Love is earned here," she said finally, her words precise, deliberate, weighted, and infinitely consequential, delivering a boundary so clear it sliced through the air between them. Rowan nodded, understanding with stark clarity that any misstep, any lapse, any attempt to shortcut trust would erase progress permanently. He understood, viscerally, that he had no rights, no claim, no authority over this life beyond the steps he chose to take with care and sincerity. Elia glanced up at him again, her small smile fragile but deliberate. The light in her eyes not naive, but measured, as though she had already decided whether to trust him, and Rowan felt the dizzying weight of responsibility settle fully on his shoulders. He rose carefully, every movement mindful, acknowledging Florina's command without speaking, aware that patience, consistency, and humility were the only paths forward. Outside, the city hummed with indifferent life, but inside the apartment, time had condensed, and each heartbeat carried the potential to build or destroy what he had so long ignored. Rowan understood with unflinching clarity that earning this life, this trust, this fragile connection would demand everything he had never been willing to give before. 7. Rowan never imagined that surrender could feel so heavy, and yet here he was, standing at the edge of a life he had meticulously built and choosing, consciously, to let it all go. The penthouse, the luxury cars, the invitations to events that had once been markers of his success. All of it now belonged to someone else, or nothing at all. He had ended the engagement quietly, without the dramatic flair he was so accustomed to, without the excuses that had been his shield in every previous relationship. He had looked into the eyes of his fiancée and admitted with brutal honesty that he had never truly chosen her. She left him with grace, understanding in her gaze that she was never the center of his world, and that realization cut deeper than any argument could have. The echo of her departing footsteps in the polished marble hallway haunted him longer than he expected, and for the first time in years, he felt the raw weight of consequence pressing against his chest. Selling the penthouse had been the easiest part, in comparison to dismantling the life he had so tightly wrapped around ambition. The sprawling city apartment, which had once been his sanctuary and symbol of dominance, now felt like a cage he had unlocked for himself. He let go of the skyline he had obsessed over, the floor-to-ceiling windows that framed nights of lonely victories and boardroom conquests. Every object he once claimed as his mark of power, the sleek furniture, the expensive art, the gadgets that whispered of innovation, was now a ghost of someone else's dreams. Rowan's life had been defined by the accumulation of these symbols, but now he measured himself by presence, by the ability to simply be with another soul without layers of pretense or expectation. Afternoons that once belonged to high-stakes deals became playgrounds, laughter and scraped knees replacing the sterile thrill of corporate conquest. He discovered that joy could be measured in seconds of shared smiles, in the light in a child's eyes, rather than in digits on a ledger. Bedtime stories, once a faint, almost embarrassing recollection from his childhood, became nightly rituals. Rowan's voice, once reserved for corporate declarations and firm negotiations, now wove worlds of adventure, bravery, and magic into the ears of a child who had every right to be wary of men who disappeared, and yet every once upon a time was a brick in a foundation he was building not for profit, not for legacy, but for connection. The lessons of regret became discipline, not self-pity, as he discovered the slow, painstaking work of earning trust. Each story read, each scraped knee kissed, each small argument navigated with patience instead of authority, became proof that transformation was possible, even for someone as hardened as Rowan. Florina watched with measured eyes, never softening when he faltered, never offering praise as if it were owed. Her silence was both challenge and protection, a constant reminder that effort alone could not buy affection or forgiveness. Rowan recognized her restraint as a mirror to his own shortcomings, a reflection he could not ignore. He had never been held accountable in such a personal, persistent way before, and it both terrified and exhilarated him. The child, Elia, observed him with cautious curiosity, sometimes with laughter, sometimes with suspicion, and Rowan learned to navigate this new hierarchy of trust. He never missed a single day, never faltered in his commitment, because every missed step was a reminder of what he had given up and what he stood to lose again. Months passed in this rhythm, slow and deliberate. Rowan's mornings began with the quiet hum of routine, breakfast prepared, toys picked up, gentle nudges toward readiness for the day. His afternoons were filled with lessons in patience, empathy, and understanding, each one punctuated by small victories that no business deal could replicate. Evenings were spent reading, storytelling, and watching Elia drift to sleep with her tiny hand in his. Yet, despite this transformation, the question from Florina that arrived one cool evening stopped him cold, pierced through his careful construction of this new life, and left him exposed. Her gaze, steady and unyielding, held a question that he knew would demand truth, not performance. It was not about the penthouse he had sold, nor the deals he had walked away from, nor even the hours he spent in play rather than power. It was about what he had truly given up for them, and whether it had been enough. Rowan's throat tightened as he searched for words, realizing that honesty could not fully convey the depths of his change. "Rowan," Florina said again, softer this time, the corner of her mouth lifting with a hint of challenge. "Do you regret it?" The world seemed to still around him, the gentle hum of the city outside fading into silence. Regret. He had sacrificed power, wealth, comfort, and the life he had meticulously designed. He had surrendered control, reputation, and ego. And yet the word felt inadequate, insufficient to describe the magnitude of the internal reshaping he had endured. For the first time, he understood that some sacrifices could never be measured simply by what was left behind. They could only be understood in the fragile space of what could be gained and what might still be lost. The air between them held a tension so thick it could be cut with his own hands, and Rowan felt the full weight of anticipation pressing against his chest. He knew that this was the moment when consistency met recognition, when effort met judgment. And though he had lived months proving himself in silence, Florina's single question now threatened to undo him completely. He wanted to speak, to reassure, to explain, yet the words faltered, dissolved into nothingness as he realized he could no longer negotiate outcomes, only honesty. His hands, usually so steady, trembled ever so slightly, betraying the storm within him. Elia, sensing the shift in the room, looked between them with innocent expectation, unaware of the invisible stakes being measured in glances and breathless pauses. Rowan bent to meet her gaze for a brief second, and the tiny smile she offered seemed to both anchor and shatter him at the same time. The question hung in the air like an unlit fuse, and Rowan felt the pulse of consequence thrumming in his veins, reminding him that this was not about past errors, nor past indulgences, but the fragile present where all meaning converged. Florina's eyes did not waver. They were the compass he could not ignore, the silent decree that his life had become public truth rather than private struggle. And then she leaned slightly closer, voice barely above a whisper. "Do you even understand what you gave up?" The weight of the words settled on his shoulders like winter frost, cold and unyielding. Rowan realized that no amount of action, no parade of diligence could erase when the day's routines have ended and the world outside continues in oblivious momentum. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the distant murmur of traffic, the faint creak of the wooden floor beneath Laura's feet, all of it became the backdrop for a moment she had been avoiding for years. A conversation she had postponed not out of fear for Jack, but out of fear for the consequences, for the unknown that waited on the other side of honesty. Jack, fully aware of the calm that preceded her most serious moments, sat cross-legged on his bed, eyes clear and unflinching. And for a heartbeat, Laura froze, the weight of everything she had protected pressing down like the dense air before a storm. She had rehearsed every word, every intonation, every possible reaction over countless nights, yet here it was. No preparation sufficient for the immediacy of a child's intuition, no strategy adequate for the simplicity of a question that carried the full weight of years absent. "Mom, is Paul my dad?" Jack asked plainly, without hesitation, without fear, his voice a gentle disruption of the stillness. A question poised not just for knowledge, but for validation, for recognition, for confirmation that the invisible threads of connection he had felt were indeed real. Laura's heart stuttered violently at the sound of it, her chest tightening, pulse hammering against the constraints of restraint she had perfected over years of solo parenting. She sat beside him, the bed sinking slightly beneath her weight, and felt every molecule of her being vibrate with anticipation, guilt, and relief, all converging into a moment of unavoidable truth. The years of silence, the careful construction of a life that had survived his absence, the battles fought alone, all of it condensed into the space between his small hands resting on the quilt and the intensity in his gaze, wide and unafraid. "Yes," she said finally, her voice steady, precise and measured, yet beneath it a tremor of vulnerability betrayed her. "Yes," the word repeated softly in her mind as it left her mouth, solidifying the truth she had carried like a fragile flame, careful to guard it against the winds of memory and consequence, and now allowed to shine in its full, unaltered reality. Jack processed the words quietly, the maturity in his comprehension remarkable for his age, the subtle nod of understanding that seemed to bypass disbelief and arrive straight at recognition. He did not cry, he did not shout, he did not recoil. Instead, he absorbed the truth, like a quiet acknowledgement of something his intuition had long suspected, the puzzle pieces of absence and observation suddenly aligning into clarity. "Is he coming to take me?" Jack asked after a pause, the words hanging in the air like a challenge wrapped in innocence. A question that carried more than curiosity, that implied both an understanding of distance and a desire for reassurance. Laura's chest constricted, her mind spinning through years of preparation, strategies and contingency plans, because she knew that the answer had to be firm, protective and unwavering. She pulled him close, wrapping arms around his small frame, pressing him gently against her chest, heart hammering, pulse racing with both fear and resolve. "No one takes you from me," she said, the words deliberate, imbued with protective authority and yet tender with the warmth of maternal reassurance. The tension remained, however, a latent presence, because she knew the truth of the world extended beyond her embrace, that consequences and desires awaited beyond the walls of her carefully curated apartment, and that each day would bring new questions, new challenges, new moments of reckoning. The next morning dawned with crisp sunlight spilling across the playground of the local soccer field, the air carrying both the scent of freshly cut grass and the faint metallic tang of early autumn. Jack had been practicing for weeks, alert and energetic, unaware that the adult he had begun to recognize in fleeting glimpses from the sidelines had arrived to witness not just his athletic skill, but the expression of his very essence. Today, he walked up to Paul without hesitation, his small shoes crunching over gravel, eyes steady, steps unaccompanied by the usual hesitancy children feel when confronted by figures both familiar and unknown. "You can sit with us," Jack said simply, decisively, the words articulated with a calm authority that surprised both Paul and Laura, a declaration of inclusion, a silent test of boundaries, a child's articulation of trust yet to be fully earned. Paul, startled by the courage and clarity in Jack's voice, knelt slowly to meet his eye level, the slight bend of his knees a subtle gesture of humility, vulnerability, and recognition of the power he had forfeited through years of absence. "Only if your mum says yes," Paul said, voice trembling just enough to betray the emotions he had spent years containing, but from the magnitude of recognition. He had caused this pain, and now, in the intimacy of their quiet room, he was forced to confront it fully. No excuses, no defenses, only the raw exposure of what his absence had inflicted. Florina's admission was not a plea. It was a statement, a declaration of what she had endured, a revelation of the cost of his former indifference. Rowan's mind raced, cataloguing every moment he had been absent, every cold word, every night he had prioritized ambition over presence. The weight was unbearable, yet strangely clarifying. He could no longer hide behind pride, could no longer mask his failures with action. There was only listening, absorbing, and committing to presence in ways he had never imagined. Her voice softened, but the intensity remained, threading each word with truth she had denied herself for too long. "I loved you," she said, her eyes glistening in the muted glow of the snowy night. When I had nothing, when you weren't here, when I was forced to build my world around hope rather than certainty. Don't mistake my love now for weakness, or let it coax guilt from you. I am not a prize to be won for penance, Rowan. I loved you without conditions, and that is a truth that remains, but it is also a warning. Rowan absorbed her words like a wave, his heart hammering in rhythm with the snow outside, realizing that love once given could not be leveraged, could not be traded, could not be assumed as payment for past mistakes. He understood, in a clarity born of struggle, that forgiveness was not a currency he had earned. It was a possibility she could grant or withhold, a fragile decision suspended between trust and fear. Rowan spoke, his voice steady, tempered by honesty rather than charm. "I'm not afraid anymore," he said, letting the truth of his transformation echo in the quiet space. "I'm not afraid of staying, of facing everything I've failed at before. I'm not afraid of being present, not afraid of being accountable. I've given up everything that kept me from you, from her, from us. I can't promise that I will never falter, but I can promise that I will never walk away again, not from you, not from Elia." Florina looked at him then, her gaze intense, measuring, scanning the contours of his expression for signs of performance or truth. Her hand trembled as she pulled slightly away, the gesture small, almost imperceptible, yet laden with caution. Rowan felt the tremor, felt the hesitation as a tangible force, a reminder that despite months of effort, despite all the sacrifices and silent devotion, the landscape of forgiveness was still untamed. It was not granted, it was not guaranteed, and in that instant, Rowan realized that love was not a culmination of actions alone. It was a negotiation of trust, a delicate balancing act between hope and the scars of memory. The snow outside thickened, draping the world in a cold white shroud that reflected the delicate tension inside. Rowan's hands remained still, hovering near her, unsure whether to reach or wait, knowing that every gesture carried meaning far beyond what he could measure. Elia stirred slightly, murmuring in her sleep, and Rowan's chest tightened with a protective instinct he had never felt in corporate boardrooms, never in triumph or achievement, but now, here, in the quiet intimacy of a night that demanded honesty. Florina's voice returned, a whisper threaded with fear and relief. "Do you understand what it means to rebuild, to truly be here?" Rowan nodded, though words failed him. He realized that understanding alone was insufficient. Presence alone was insufficient. What she sought was the embodiment of change, a consistent, undeniable demonstration that he was no longer the man who abandoned, the man who prioritized power over love. And as he watched her, the tremor in her hand, the hesitation in her gaze, he recognized that the path ahead was neither linear nor guaranteed. Each moment now carried weight, each choice would be scrutinized, each gesture evaluated against the memory of absence. A sudden gust of wind rattled the window, startling Elia awake for a moment. Rowan leaned forward instinctively, securing her in his arms, while Florina's eyes softened, reflecting a mixture of exhaustion and something he could not yet name. Trust, perhaps, or hope. The room was silent again, but the silence was no longer empty. It was charged, electric, the space between them a conduit for emotion that had been long suppressed. Rowan realized that the night itself had become a participant in their reconciliation, each falling snowflake a reminder of fragility, each shadow a test of endurance. Florina's voice cut through once more, quieter now, trembling with the weight of honesty. "I want to believe, Rowan. I want to. But I need to know that this isn't about guilt, that you're here because you want to be, because you choose to stay, that you are not just afraid of losing me again, but that you are here, fully, intentionally, with all of you." Rowan's heart clenched, knowing that these words were not an accusation, but a challenge, a threshold he had to cross. He had spent months proving himself in action, but now words were required, not hollow promises, but the kind of truth that could be measured in years, in small gestures, in patience and resilience. And then, in the soft glow of the snowy night, Rowan made the conscious, unflinching choice to lean in, to meet her gaze fully, and say without hesitation, "I am here. Not out of fear, not out of guilt. I am here because I choose this, because I cannot imagine a life without you and Elia. I will stay, every day, every moment, because this is where I belong." Florina's lips parted slightly, a tear tracing down her cheek, her hand hovering just above his chest, as if she were deciding whether to let herself fall fully or retreat again, leaving Rowan suspended between hope and despair, waiting for the final act of surrender. The snow outside had long since melted into the muted greys of early winter, leaving the city streets glistening with the quiet sheen of frost and rain. Inside, warmth wrapped the apartment like a protective cloak, a tangible contrast to the biting cold beyond the windows. Rowan sat quietly in the living room, Elia perched on the floor beside him, constructing a fortress of colourful blocks with deliberate care. He watched her small hands fit each piece together, her brow furrowed in concentration, and he realized how profoundly different this life was from the one he had once obsessed over, the life of deals, contracts, and deadlines. Here there was no room for power or pride. There was only presence, patience, and the delicate construction of trust, brick by fragile brick. Rowan's hands hovered over the blocks, ready to assist, yet he restrained himself, allowing Elia to claim each victory on her own, knowing that this was part of the lesson he had learned over the months, that true love and commitment could not be forced or purchased. They had to be earned daily, with consistency and humility. Florina entered the room silently, watching them from the doorway, her eyes tracing the contours of Rowan's focused expression. 1 year had passed since the night she had laid bare her fears, and during that time she had tested him endlessly, not with cruelty, but with careful, intentional distance and truth. Rowan had faced each challenge without complaint or self-interest. He had not asked for rewards, he had not demanded validation, and he had never again disappeared from the fragile ecosystem of trust he was building. Love had returned between them slowly, carefully, shaped by scars, tempered by months of proving that devotion was more than words. It was presence, patience, and unwavering consistency. Florina's gaze softened imperceptibly as she watched Rowan bend to fix a toy Elia had knocked over, his movements deliberate but without hesitation, his attention wholly focused on the child who represented both past mistakes and future hope. She saw not a billionaire, not the man whose absence had carved voids into her life, but a father who had remained, who had chosen every day to be here. Her heart, long guarded and meticulously shielded, finally allowed a sliver of warmth to seep through, yet without surrendering the dignity she had fiercely preserved. Florina did not need to forgive for the sake of reunion. She did not need to surrender for the sake of closure. She chose this moment because it felt real, earned, and irrevocable. She stepped closer, and Rowan's gaze rose to meet hers. A flicker of recognition passing between them, an acknowledgement that the journey had been long, painful, but transformative. The space between them was charged, filled with the quiet acknowledgement of months of effort, nights of vigilance, and the slow building of trust that could not be rushed, fabricated, or demanded. Elia's laughter rang out, bright and unrestrained, as she managed to balance the final block on the top of her colourful tower. Rowan's hands hovered briefly, then steadied the structure, a subtle gesture of care, and his eyes met Florina's once again. In that glance, 1,000 unspoken words passed between them. The regrets, the lessons, the silent nights of presence, and the promises fulfilled not in grand gestures, but in daily commitment. Florina, feeling the weight and sincerity of every action, finally reached for Rowan's hand, not out of necessity, not out of pity, but by choice. Her fingers intertwined with his with deliberate intent, and in that simple act, months of guardedness and careful testing melted into a quiet, profound connection. This was not the culmination of a fairy tale reunion. It was something stronger, more enduring, because it was real, built on truth, scars, and unwavering dedication. Rowan's chest tightened with emotion, a mixture of relief, gratitude, and reverent fear of losing what he had finally earned. The memory of all he had sacrificed, the penthouse, the empire of ambition, the life he had meticulously constructed around power, contrasted starkly with the depth of the connection he now held in his hands. He realized fully that losing Florina and Elia again would destroy him utterly, and the thought of such loss fortified his determination to remain steadfast, patient, and fully present. There were no shortcuts, no grand displays of wealth or charm. The path to redemption had been slow, deliberate, and exhausting, but it had yielded a prize far greater than he had ever imagined: love grounded in truth, trust hard-earned, and the unshakable bond of family. The morning light shifted, spilling golden hues across the room, illuminating the small, intricate world they had built together. Elia's laughter subsided as she crawled into Rowan's lap, nestling between him and Florina. Rowan wrapped his arms around both of them, feeling the warmth and fragility of the moment as if it were a tangible entity, a treasure beyond valuation. Florina rested her head lightly on his shoulder, her hand still entwined with his, and he felt the steady rhythm of her breathing align with his own, a silent symphony of endurance, trust, and cautious hope. Words were unnecessary in this moment. Everything that needed to be communicated was written in the stillness, the touch, the mutual acknowledgement of what had been lost and what had been painstakingly rebuilt. They spent the day together, ordinary in its activities, yet monumental in its significance. Rowan helped Elia decorate a small Christmas tree, their laughter mingling, punctuated by gentle corrections and encouragement. Florina watched silently, absorbing the scene with a sense of wonder she had not permitted herself to feel in years, realizing that her love for Rowan had transformed, no longer naive, no longer conditional on absence, but robust, discerning, and anchored in reality. The warmth of domestic life, of shared responsibility and mutual respect, had replaced the cold allure of wealth and dominance that had once defined him. Rowan was present fully, mind, heart, and soul, and Florina recognized that presence as the ultimate proof of change, the tangible embodiment of commitment she had longed to see. As evening descended and the glow of the tree lights reflected in their eyes, Rowan leaned slightly toward Florina, voice quiet but resolute. "I know I cannot undo the past, and I will never ask for your forgiveness as if it is owed," he said, each word deliberate, heavy with truth. "All I can do is be here every day and prove that I will never walk away again. That is my promise, not just to you, but to Elia, and to the life we are building together." Florina met his gaze fully, seeing the depth of sincerity, the unwavering dedication in his eyes, and for the first time she allowed herself to fully hope, to trust, to choose love actively rather than defensively. Elia yawned, curling into Rowan's chest, and he held her as if the world outside no longer existed. Florina's hand tightened around his, a subtle signal of her acceptance, a quiet testament that love had returned not in grand declarations or dramatic gestures, but through years of earned presence and relentless consistency. The room, warm with light and life, felt like a sanctuary, a place where past mistakes had been acknowledged, scars honored, and a future deliberately nurtured. In that embrace, Rowan understood that real love was not instantaneous, not predicated on instant reconciliation or forgiveness. It was slow, deliberate, resilient, and unwavering. As night deepened, The three of them sat together, sharing stories, laughter, and quiet moments of reflection. Rowan looked at Florina, the woman who had challenged, tested, and finally allowed him into the full measure of her trust. She was not simply his partner, nor was she a reward for redemption. She was the compass by which he now measured his actions, the anchor that grounded him in truth. In her eyes, he saw not past mistakes, but the promise of a shared future, carefully and deliberately earned. The final moment of the evening arrived as they gathered around the small tree, Elia's eyes wide with wonder as she held a handmade ornament. Rowan knelt to adjust it, his fingers steady, careful, while Florina watched silently, her heart full, her hand resting in his. There was no fanfare, no sudden declarations, only the quiet certainty of earned love, the kind that would not vanish in absence or weakness. Rowan knew, with unshakable clarity, that this was the life he had chosen fully, the family he could not and would not lose. The warmth, trust, and connection they shared that night became the foundation of all that would follow, a testament to patience, humility, and devotion. And as the snow began to fall lightly outside once again, dusting the city with silver, Rowan felt a sense of completion that was deeper than triumph or victory. It was the quiet satisfaction of having earned a second chance and understanding, finally, that real love was never given freely, but painstakingly chosen, daily and with intention. He squeezed Florina's hand, and she responded with a squeeze of her own, a final affirmation that this time everything was real, everything was mutual, and everything was worth holding on to. The future was theirs, not promised, but deliberately and beautifully constructed. Rowan's eyes met Florina's one last time that evening, and in that gaze, without a single word, they both understood the truth. Losing each other again was impossible, because what they had earned together was far stronger than fear, absence, or regret. It was irrevocable, unshakable, and real. Wow. What an emotional journey. Thank you so much for listening to this story on Beyond Color Stories. I want to hear from you. What did you think? Did it touch your heart or shock you? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to rate this story out of 10. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button now so you never miss another unforgettable story. And remember, the next story is just around the corner. So stay tuned, and I'll see you there.